Before we begin tonight's journey into one of America's most persistent mysteries, I want to ask a quick favour. If you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you possibly know and allows us to keep bringing you these deep dives into history's shadows. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes a massive difference for us. And if you feel like it, drop a comment telling us what time it is, where you are, and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening. Finally, if you enjoy this kind of content, please consider subscribing. It keeps these stories coming. And a huge thank you to Michael for suggesting tonight's topic. This one goes deep. Now let's talk about a secret society that might have changed America forever. Picture this. It's late April in the year 1865. Richmond, Virginia, lies in ruins. Smoke still rises from buildings set ablaze during the evacuation. The Confederate capital has fallen, and Jefferson Davis, president of the dying Confederacy, is fleeing south with whatever remains of his government. In the chaos of that retreat, a train of wagons moves through the darkness, creaking under the weight of heavy cargo. The guards riding alongside are exhausted, but they stay alert. They know what they're protecting. Gold bars wrapped in canvas, silver coins in wooden chests, banknotes and bonds representing fortunes. The final treasury of the Confederate States of America. Everything that remains of a nation that's bleeding to death. History tells us most of that gold was captured, stolen or lost during the desperate retreat. The official records are clear. The case is closed. The Confederate treasury was seized or scattered, and that's the end of it. But what if I told you that eyewitness accounts from that period tell a very different story? What if Union officers testified, under oath, that massive quantities of gold were never recovered? What if there was no clear chain of custody for millions of dollars worth of Confederate assets? What if the math simply doesn't add up, and nobody wants to talk about why? And what if the same name kept appearing in post-war rumours, whispered in backrooms and coded letters? A name that most history textbooks barely mention, if they mention it at all. A name that makes historians uncomfortable when you bring it up at academic conferences. The Knights of the Golden Circle. Tonight, we're going to explore one of America's most enduring conspiracy theories. A secret society that may have planned the Civil War, financed terrorism, and hidden a fortune that could still be buried somewhere in the American South. This isn't fiction. Every event I'm about to describe is documented. The only question is how the pieces fit together. So settle in, turn down the lights, and let me tell you about the secret society the Civil War never buried. Chapter 1. The Birth of an Empire. The year is 1854. Most Americans have never heard of Kansas, Nebraska. The Republican Party is brand new, formed just months earlier by anti-slavery activists who are horrified by the expansion of slavery into Western territories. And in Cincinnati, Ohio, a man named George Washington Lafayette Bickley is about to change history in ways that are still being felt today. Bickley was a curious figure, and that's putting it mildly. Officially he was a physician, though his medical credentials were questionable at best. He claimed to have studied in Britain, but no records support this. He styled himself as a professor and academic, but universities had no record of employing him. What he really was, in modern terms, was a con artist, a propagandist, and what we might today call a political operative with dangerous ideas. But he had charisma. People who met him described a tall, imposing figure with piercing eyes and a voice that could fill a room. He could talk for hours without notes, weaving elaborate visions of Southern glory and manifest destiny. He understood something fundamental about human nature. People don't just want to belong to something. They want to belong to something secret, something special, something that makes them feel chosen. In that year, Bickley founded a secret society. He called it the Knights of the Golden Circle. The name wasn't poetic or symbolic. It was literal, and it was terrifying if you understood what it meant. Bickley envisioned a slave-holding empire that would stretch in a massive circle, 2,400 miles in radius, centered on Havana, Cuba. This golden circle would encompass the entire American South, all of Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean islands. It would be, in Bickley's feverish vision, a paradise built on slave labour and southern aristocracy. An empire where wealthy white landowners would rule over millions of enslaved people, extracting unlimited wealth from sugar, cotton, and coffee plantations stretching from Virginia to Venezuela. The plan was detailed, disturbingly detailed. Bickley didn't just have a vision, he had maps, he had economic projections, he had military strategies for conquering Mexico and Central America. He had calculated how many enslaved workers would be needed, how much profit could be generated, how the empire would be governed. It sounds insane. It was insane. But here's the thing that should genuinely disturb you. People listened. Important people, wealthy people, powerful people. The Knights of the Golden Circle wasn't some fringe group meeting in basements and wearing silly hats. It was organised like a military operation from day one. The structure was hierarchical and sophisticated. At the top were the castle leaders, men of wealth and influence who recruited members and organised local chapters. Below them were degrees of initiation, each requiring oaths, rituals, and the learning of secret codes and hand signals. Members didn't just join, they were initiated. The ceremonies involved darkness, candles, dramatic oaths sworn on weapons and symbols. New members were told they were joining something ancient and powerful, though in reality the organisation was barely older than they were. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the feeling of being part of a brotherhood, a conspiracy, a movement that was going to reshape the world. The Knights learned coded language that allowed them to identify each other and communicate in plain sight. They used hand signs borrowed from Masonic traditions. They organised into local chapters called castles, each with its own treasury, meeting place, and roster of members, and they recruited aggressively, targeting men with influence, money, and military experience. By the year 1860, just 6 years after the organisation's founding, conservative estimates suggest the Knights had over 40,000 members across the South and border states. Some historians think the number was much higher, possibly as many as 60 or 70,000. They had infiltrated southern military units, state legislatures, railroad companies and banks. They had money, influence, and most importantly a plan. The KGC wasn't just talking about secession, they were preparing for it. They were stockpiling weapons, they were identifying targets, they were creating networks that could move information, money and people across state lines without detection. They were building an infrastructure for war before the war had even started. And here's what should really make you think. When the Civil War finally came, when the South seceded and the shooting started, Confederate leaders seemed remarkably prepared. Communication networks were already in place, supply lines had been thought through, sympathisers in northern states were already organised and ready to cause problems. How much of that preparedness came from the Knights of the Golden Circle? We'll never know for sure, but the timing is awfully convenient. Chapter 2. The Shadow War. When the Civil War finally erupted in April of 1861 with the Confederate bombardment of Fort Sumter, something strange happened to the Knights of the Golden Circle. Officially, publicly, the organisation dissolved. Newspapers that had occasionally mentioned the group suddenly stopped. Meeting halls went quiet. The Knights of the Golden Circle seemed to have vanished into history just as the conflict they had helped create was beginning. But Union intelligence reports tell a very different story. And these weren't conspiracy theories or rumours. These were official military intelligence documents, filed by commanders who were genuinely worried about what they were seeing. The Knights didn't disappear. They simply went underground and changed their names, the way a criminal might use an alias when the law gets too close. Some became the Order of American Knights. Others called themselves the Sons of Liberty, deliberately invoking Revolutionary War imagery to make their treason seem patriotic. Same members, same oaths, same goals, just different letterhead. And throughout the war, accusations followed them like a shadow that wouldn't be shaken off. Union authorities documented case after case of sabotage, particularly in the border states of Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois. These weren't Confederate states, these were Union territory. But they were full of Southern sympathizers, And more importantly, they were full of nights. Railroad tracks would be destroyed the night before major troop movements. How did the saboteurs know when trains would be passing? Telegraph lines would be cut at exactly the moments when Union commanders needed to communicate most urgently. Coincidence or inside information? Weapons shipments that should have reached Union armies mysteriously disappeared in transit. Where did those weapons go? Were they sold? Hidden? Sent south to Confederate forces? Draft resistance seemed too organised to be spontaneous. When the Union implemented conscription in 1863, riots erupted in multiple northern cities at almost the same time. That takes coordination. That takes planning. That takes an existing network of people willing to act together. Union commanders, particularly in the Western Theatre, became convinced they were fighting two wars simultaneously. One war against the Confederate Army in the South, which was difficult enough, and another war against a secret network operating in their own backyard, behind their own lines, sabotaging their efforts from within. The most dramatic case came in the summer of 1864 in Indianapolis, Indiana. Union authorities had been investigating suspected KGC activity for months. They were building a case, gathering evidence, identifying members, and in August they finally had enough to act. They arrested Harrison H. Dodd, identified as a high-ranking leader in what was now calling itself the Order of the American Knights. Dodd was a lawyer, a respected member of the community. He had money and connections. But Union investigators had evidence, they claimed, that he was planning something much bigger than simple draft resistance. The charges were staggering. Dodd was accused of planning to break Confederate prisoners out of northern prison camps and arm them for attacks on Union cities. The plan allegedly involved coordinating simultaneous uprisings in Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois, timed to coincide with Confederate military operations in the South. The goal was nothing less than forcing the Union to fight a two-front war, to divide their forces and potentially tip the balance toward Confederate victory. If even half of these charges were true, it was one of the most ambitious plots of the entire war. Dodd was placed under heavy guard in Indianapolis, awaiting a military tribunal that would almost certainly result in his execution for treason. And then he escaped, just walked out, disappeared, vanished like smoke. The official explanation was embarrassingly vague. Guards were supposedly bribed or distracted. Dodd had help from someone, obviously, but who? And where did he go afterward? Harrison H. Dodd was never found again. He didn't turn up dead. He wasn't captured later in the war. He simply ceased to exist in the historical record. A high-profile prisoner, accused of plotting massive domestic terrorism, just disappeared. How does that happen? How does a man awaiting trial for treason against the United States simply vanish in the middle of the largest war in American history? Who helped him? Where did he go? Did he flee to Confederate territory? Did he hide in plain sight under a new identity? Did he continue his activities from the shadows? The official records don't say. They can't say, because nobody knows. Or if anyone knew, they never told. But investigators at the time began to suspect something that would have been almost too frightening to admit publicly. The Knights of the Golden Circle, or whatever they were calling themselves now, hadn't been planning just for war. They had been planning for defeat. They were thinking long-term. They were preparing for a struggle that wouldn't end with military victory or defeat, but would continue for years, maybe decades afterward. They were preparing for the long game, and that meant they needed to survive as an organisation regardless of who won the war. Chapter 3. The Gold That Vanished. Let's go back to that night in April of 1865. Richmond, Virginia has fallen to Union forces. The Confederate capital, the beating heart of the rebellion, is now behind enemy lines. Robert E. Lee has surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse. The war is over, at least for all practical purposes. Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederate States of America, is fleeing south with what remains of his cabinet. They're moving fast, trying desperately to reach Texas or Mexico before Union cavalry catches them. It's a sad end for a government that once controlled 11 states and fielded massive armies. Now it's reduced to a handful of officials and guards. riding through the night, hoping to outrun history. With them travels the Confederate treasury or what's left of it. Wagons loaded with boxes and barrels, guards posted at all times, everything that remains of a nation's wealth, being hauled down muddy roads in the darkness. On May 10th, 1865, Union troops finally catch up with Davis near Irwinville, Georgia. The capture itself is almost anticlimactic. Davis, exhausted and despairing, is taken without a fight. Union officers search the camp and seize the assets they find. Some gold coins, some silver. Personal effects belonging to Davis and his family. They load it all up, document what they've captured, and send Davis north to imprisonment. Case closed. War over. The Confederate treasury has been recovered, except it hasn't. Not really. Because here's where it gets interesting, and by interesting I mean deeply suspicious. The amount of gold and silver seized at Irwinville didn't match Confederate financial records. Not even close. Not within several $1 million of close. Confederate ledgers indicated the government had received substantial foreign loans, particularly from British and French sympathisers who believed in the Southern cause and saw profit in supporting it. They had held massive payroll funds to pay Confederate soldiers and officers. They had controlled private assets from Southern banks and wealthy donors who had literally given their fortunes to the cause. Ships had run the Union blockade carrying gold. Bonds had been sold. Wealth had been concentrated. Where did it all go? Union authorities interrogated Davis and his associates extensively. They weren't gentle about it. They wanted answers. They needed answers. The American people were demanding answers. Where was the Confederate gold? The responses they got were vague, contradictory, or simply non-existent. Some prisoners claimed the money had been spent during the long retreat from Richmond to Georgia. Spent on what? Food? Supplies? With what they had to show for it? Others said it had been stolen by deserting soldiers in the chaos of the Confederate collapse. Possible, but that would mean finding huge amounts of gold on random deserters, and that didn't happen. A few witnesses gave a different explanation, and this one kept coming up in different interviews, from different people who had no reason to coordinate their stories. They said the money had been distributed to various trusted officers with orders to hide it until the South could rise again. Hide it geographically. Spread it out. Make it impossible to find or seize all at once. That last explanation kept coming up. Hide it until the South could rise again. Not spend it. Not secure it. Hide it. As if defeat was not the end of the conflict, but merely an intermission. Witnesses later came forward with stories that gave texture to these vague explanations. A wagon train guarded by men in Confederate uniforms, splitting off from the main column near the Georgia-South Carolina border and heading into the wilderness. Where were they going? Nobody followed to find out. Gold bars being loaded onto mules in the dead of night while the main camp slept. Who ordered it? Who received it? Trusted officers receiving sealed orders from Davis himself and then disappearing into the countryside, never to rejoin the retreating government. And when investigators tried to track down these officers, tried to follow these leads, they hit walls. The men involved? Many were later identified as former Knights of the Golden Circle members, not suspected members, documented members whose names appeared on captured KGC membership rolls from earlier in the war. Southern bankers with secret affiliations who had managed the Confederacy's finances. Confederate intelligence officers who had spent the war running covert operations. These weren't random choices. These were men selected for a reason. Men who could keep secrets. Men who belonged to organisations that valued loyalty unto death. By 1866, barely a year after the war's end, rumours were spreading across the South like a fever. The gold was out there somewhere, buried in caches scattered across multiple states, hidden in caves known only to a few, divided among trusted guardians who had sworn oaths to protect it with their lives, and all of it allegedly marked with symbols, protected by coded maps, and defended by men who would kill to keep the secret. The treasure hunt had begun, and it would claim lives for decades to come. Chapter 4. Symbols in the Woods. Over the next several decades, something strange started happening across the American South. People began finding things in the woods, in their fields, carved into rocks on their property. Strange symbols, deliberate markings, messages from the past written in a language most people couldn't read. The symbols were consistent enough that researchers eventually compiled catalogues trying to decode them. Hearts with arrows pointing in specific directions, turtles with marks on their shells indicating numbers or distances, owls with one eye open, turkey tracks arranged in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be natural, snakes forming circles or figure eights, all arranged in ways that suggested purpose, meaning, direction. These weren't random scratches made by bored travellers. These were carved with tools, positioned in relation to landmarks, often protected from weather by overhangs or deliberate placement. Someone had spent time on them. Someone had meant them to last. Someone had intended them to be found by people who would know what they meant. Were these markers pointing to buried Confederate gold? Or were they elaborate hoaxes created by con artists preying on Southern desperation and nostalgia? The problem with dismissing them as hoaxes is simple and disturbing. People who found these markers often died. Not eventually, not of old age, suspiciously, quickly, under circumstances that didn't quite add up. I'm not exaggerating for effect. There's a pattern in the historical record that's genuinely disturbing when you see it laid out. A farmer in rural Georgia finds a carved stone on his property while ploughing. It's got symbols he doesn't recognise, but they're clearly man-made and look old. He mentions it at church the following Sunday, excited about the possibility of finding treasure. 2 weeks later, he's found dead in the woods, supposedly from a hunting accident. Except he wasn't carrying a rifle. His rifle was found at home, so who shot him? A prospector in Arkansas discovers a map hidden in the lining of an old Confederate uniform he bought from a widow. The map shows landmarks he recognises, symbols he doesn't. He starts asking around town about the symbols, showing the map to people he trusts. His cabin burns down 3 weeks later with him inside. The fire inspector rules it an accident, despite finding evidence the door had been nailed shut from the outside. A family in Missouri begins digging in a suspicious location on their land after the grandfather claims he remembers Confederate soldiers burying something there during the war. They find a stone marker with KGC symbols. They dig deeper. Armed men arrive at their property one night, masked and carrying weapons. They order the family to stop digging, to forget what they've seen, and to never speak of it again. The family stops digging. They don't report it to the sheriff. When asked about it years later, they claim they don't remember what the armed men looked like or how many there were. They're terrified, decades after the fact. The newspapers of the late 1800s are full of these stories, particularly in Texas, Arkansas, Missouri, Kentucky and Georgia. Local papers would run articles about mysterious deaths, strange intimidation, and treasure hunting gone wrong. And here's the unsettling part. In most cases, local sheriffs didn't investigate thoroughly. Or if they did, the cases were quietly dropped without explanation. Why? What pressure was being applied? Who had enough influence in multiple states to make law enforcement back off repeatedly? The implication is obvious but terrifying. Someone was guarding something, and they had enough power, enough reach, enough organisational capability to intimidate local law enforcement in multiple states across multiple decades. That's not a random group of treasure hoarders. That's an organisation, a network, a conspiracy that functioned across state lines and across generations. In the 1890s, newspapers in Texas and Arkansas ran multiple stories about mysterious armed men forcing landowners to abandon property. These weren't robberies. The armed men didn't steal anything. They didn't want the land, they just wanted the residents gone, immediately and permanently. No explanations, no negotiations. Just leave and don't come back. Some families complied. They packed up and left, abandoning property they'd owned for decades. Others tried to stand their ground and found themselves facing escalating harassment. Livestock killed, barns burned, warning shots fired at night. Eventually everyone left. Who were these men? What were they protecting? Were they remnants of the Knights of the Golden Circle, still operating decades after the Civil War? Were they descendants of the original knights, carrying on some kind of guardian tradition passed down through families? Were they hired muscle being paid by someone with resources and a vested interest in keeping certain areas undisturbed? Or were they something else entirely? Something that had evolved from the knights but wasn't quite the same? Organisation anymore? Chapter 5. From Knights to Clan. We need to talk about timing. And when I say we need to talk about it, I mean this is one of those historical coincidences that's almost too convenient to be a coincidence. December of 1865, Pulaski, Tennessee, just 8 months after the war's end. 6 Confederate veterans are sitting around, bored and restless. The war is over. They lost. The world they knew is gone. The social order they fought to preserve is being dismantled by Reconstruction. They're young men with military training and no purpose, so they form a social club. At least that's what they claim it is. They're bored, they say. They want something to do. They create elaborate costumes, mysterious rituals, grandiose titles that sound impressive but mean nothing. They ride through town at night in sheets and hoods, pretending to be ghosts of dead Confederate soldiers. It's all just pranks and theatre, they insist. They call themselves the Ku Klux Klan. The name comes from the Greek word kuklos, meaning circle. Interesting choice of words, isn't it? Circle. At first, it really did seem to be just a social club. Costumes and midnight rides. Pranks designed to startle freedmen and carpetbaggers. It was juvenile, offensive, but not yet organised violence. But within 2 years, something changed. The play acting stopped being play. The social club transformed into something much darker, much more dangerous. A terrorist organisation dedicated to violently resisting Reconstruction and maintaining white supremacy through intimidation, assault, and murder. The transformation was remarkably quick and remarkably organised. Local chapters appeared across the South almost simultaneously. They had uniform rituals, similar costumes, and coordinated tactics. They operated with military precision. When they decided to target someone, the attacks would happen on the same night in multiple counties, making it impossible for limited law enforcement to respond effectively. This wasn't organic growth. This was activation of an existing network. The early Klan had a structure that looked awfully, disturbingly familiar to anyone who had studied Confederate secret societies. Secret oaths sworn in darkness, coded language that allowed members to identify each other, local chapters operating independently but following central guidance, a hierarchical command system with elaborate titles, blood initiation ceremonies, penalties for breaking oaths that were clearly stated and genuinely frightening. Sound like anyone we've been talking about? Here's where conspiracy theorists get very interested, and honestly, their interest isn't entirely unjustified. Several early Klan leaders had documented ties to Confederate intelligence networks during the war. Nathan Bedford Forrest, the Klan's first Grand Wizard, had commanded cavalry units that included known KGC members. He had experience with covert operations, raids behind enemy, lines, and the kind of decentralized command structure that secret organizations require. Other early Klan leaders had backgrounds in secret fraternal organizations. They knew how to create rituals that bound men together. They understood the psychology of secret societies, how shared secrets create loyalty stronger than law or conscience. And the Klan's rapid spread across the South followed patterns that looked less like spontaneous organization and more like activation of an existing network. It was as if someone had a list of trusted men in each county, men who could be relied upon to organize and lead, men who already knew how to operate in secret, men who had done this before. Could the Knights of the Golden Circle have simply rebranded again? Could the KGC's ideology, infrastructure, membership roles, and yes, hidden wealth have been absorbed into the Klan? There's no smoking gun. No document that says, "Dear Klan, love the Knights of the Golden Circle. Here's our member list, our operational procedures, and some gold to fund your activities." Historical conspiracies rarely leave convenient paper trails, but the circumstantial evidence is deeply, profoundly uncomfortable. Both organizations had essentially identical goals: preserve Southern power structures, resist federal authority by any means necessary, and maintain racial hierarchies through violence if needed. Both used secret rituals and violent intimidation as their primary tools. Both operated through decentralized cells that were difficult for authorities to infiltrate or destroy. Both had support from local elites who provided protection and resources, and both had financial resources that seemed to exceed what you'd expect from their claimed origins. Where did the early clan get its funding? Sheets and robes cost money, horses cost money, arms cost money. Coordinating across multiple states costs money. Someone was paying for all of this, and it wasn't membership dues from poor farmers. How did it spread so quickly across such a large geographic area? Who was coordinating the violence? Who was training local leaders? Who was providing the operational manuals that made different clan chapters operate so similarly? The official histories don't have good answers to these questions. Maybe because the truth was too disturbing to admit. Maybe because acknowledging a direct link between the KGC and the clan would have meant admitting that Reconstruction was facing an organised insurgency with deep roots and significant resources, not just random violence from sore losers. That would have been a terrifying admission for the federal government to make. It would have meant the Civil War hadn't really ended. It had just changed tactics. Chapter 6. The Lincoln Question. We have to address the elephant in the room. Or rather, the assassination at the theatre. April 14th, 1865. Ford's Theatre in Washington, District of Columbia. The play is Our American Cousin, a comedy that's popular with wartime audiences looking for distraction. President Abraham Lincoln is in the presidential box with his wife Mary, Major Henry Rathbone, and Rathbone's fiancée Clara Harris. They're relaxed. The war is essentially over. Lincoln can finally breathe. At approximately 10:15 in the evening, John Wilkes Booth enters the presidential box. He's an actor. He's been in this theatre many times. The staff knows him. Nobody stops him. He knows the play well enough to time his approach for a moment when the audience will be laughing, covering the sound of his entry. Booth shoots President Abraham Lincoln in the back of the head at point-blank range. Lincoln slumps forward, mortally wounded. He'll die the next morning, never regaining consciousness. Booth leaps from the box to the stage, breaking his leg in the landing, and shouts something the witnesses can't quite agree on. Then he limps out of the theatre and disappears into the Washington night. For 12 days, John Wilkes Booth evades capture. Let that sink in. The most wanted man in America, having just committed the most significant assassination in the nation's history, manages to avoid capture for nearly 2 weeks. How? He moves through a network of safe houses. He crosses the Potomac River into Virginia. He finds people willing to hide him, feed him, treat his injuries. He has contacts, resources, and most importantly, a plan that extends beyond the assassination itself. This wasn't a spontaneous act by a lone madman. This was planned. This was coordinated. This had infrastructure behind it. Eventually, Union cavalry tracks Booth down to a tobacco barn near Bowling Green, Virginia. They surround the barn. They demand his surrender. Booth refuses. The barn is set on fire to force him out. In the chaos and smoke, a shot rings out. Booth falls, mortally wounded. He dies a few hours later. The official story is that Sergeant Boston Corbett, acting against orders, shot Booth to prevent his escape. Corbett claimed divine instruction to fire. He was never punished. Some witnesses said it looked like Booth shot himself. The truth died with everyone in that barn. The official investigation concluded that Booth was part of a conspiracy, but a relatively small one. A handful of co-conspirators, all Confederate sympathizers, acting largely on their own initiative to strike a blow against the Union government. 8 people were arrested, tried and convicted. 4 were hanged. Case closed. Except it wasn't closed. Not really. It never has been. Researchers have spent over a century and a half picking apart Booth's movements, his contacts and his resources, and some of what they've found is genuinely troubling, raising questions that official history has never satisfactorily answered. Booth had connections to known Confederate intelligence operatives, not suspected connections, documented ones. He had travelled to Canada in the months before the Yale assassination, where Confederate agents were known to be operating. He had money. More money than an actor should have had. Where did it come from? His escape route followed pathways that matched documented Underground Railroad routes used by Southern agents during the war. Not approximately, exactly. The same houses, the same contacts, the same methods. Someone had planned this route before, tested it, confirmed it would work. The safe houses that sheltered Booth weren't random Confederate sympathisers. They had ties to secret societies and organised Southern resistance networks. Some had connections, documented in later research, to men who had been Knights of the Golden Circle members before the war. And here's the really interesting part that conspiracy researchers focus on. The assistance network Booth used looked remarkably similar to the escape tactics attributed to the Knights of the Golden Circle during the war. The organisation, the security protocols, the way information was compartmentalised so that each link in the chain only knew the next step, not the whole plan. This is sophisticated tradecraft. This is how intelligence organisations operate. This isn't how a random group of angry Southerners would organise an assassination plot. Did the Knights help plan Lincoln's assassination? Did they provide Booth with resources, training and support? Were they part of a larger plot to decapitate the Union government and create chaos that might somehow revive Confederate hopes? The conspiracy theorists point to several disturbing coincidences. The assassination happened just days after Lee's surrender, when Confederate cause was clearly lost. Why then? If it was about changing the war's outcome, it was too late. But if it was about revenge, or about creating a martyred president whose death would poison Reconstruction and benefit Southern resistance, then the timing makes perfect sense. Official investigations never proved KGC involvement. They never even seriously investigated it. But they also never fully ruled it out. The evidence was circumstantial, fragmentary, and often destroyed or lost. What we're left with is a question mark, a big one. And the more you look at the details, the more you notice the gaps in the official story, the bigger that question mark becomes. Chapter 7. The 20th Century Ghosts. You might think that by the 1900s the Knights of the Golden Circle would be ancient history. A relic of the Civil War era, as dead as the Confederacy itself. Something that belonged in dusty archives and academic dissertations, not in the living world. But strange things kept happening. Little things, easily dismissed individually but disturbing when you see them as a pattern. Throughout the early 20th century, occasional reports surfaced that didn't quite make sense. Men in small southern towns identifying themselves as knights to people they thought they could trust. Why would anyone claim membership in a defunct organisation unless it wasn't actually defunct? Old Confederate symbols appearing in unexpected places, carved into the foundations of new buildings, or incorporated into business logos in ways that seemed deliberately coded. Bank records tied to defunct Southern trusts that seemed to have more money than they should, funds that appeared to grow over time rather than depleting. In 1934, something happened in Oklahoma that encapsulates the entire mystery. A man named William, a carpenter and amateur historian, was renovating an old house that had supposedly been built by a Confederate veteran. He was tearing out a wall when he found something hidden in the cavity between the studs. A map, hand-drawn on aged paper, sealed in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. The map showed local landmarks, some of which still existed, others that William had to research to identify, and it was covered in symbols, hearts, turtles, owls, the same symbols that had been appearing on treasure maps and stone markers for 70 years. William was excited. He was careful. He didn't immediately announce his find to the world. He showed it to a few trusted friends. He started researching the symbols, trying to decode them. He planned an expedition to some of the marked locations. He was methodical, thoughtful, doing everything right. 3 weeks later, William was found dead in his home. The official cause of death was listed as heart attack. He was 32 years old, in good health, with no family history of heart problems. He'd been working in his garage when it happened, apparently. Alone. No witnesses. The map disappeared. When William's widow looked for it among his possessions, it was gone. She knew he'd been keeping it in a locked drawer in his workshop. The drawer was still locked. The map wasn't there, she never reported it missing. When researchers tried to interview her years later about her husband's death, she refused to discuss it. She was afraid, decades after the fact. You could see it in her eyes, people said. She was still afraid. This pattern repeated itself again and again throughout the century. Someone finds something, maybe an old map, maybe a journal, maybe carved symbols on their property. They get excited, they tell people, they start investigating. Then suddenly they don't want to talk anymore. Or they can't. In 1957, a man in Arkansas claimed he'd found a carved stone with KGC symbols while clearing land. He brought it to the local historical society, excited to share his discovery. The society photographed it, documented it, and asked if they could keep it for further study. He agreed. 2 weeks later, he returned and demanded the stone back, visibly shaken. The society returned it. He destroyed it with a sledgehammer in the parking lot, then left and never spoke of it again. Historical society members later said he looked terrified, like someone had put a genuine fear into him. In 1973, a construction crew in East Texas accidentally uncovered what appeared to be a small buried vault while excavating for a shopping centre foundation. Inside were Confederate coins, personal effects, and documents. The vault had KGC symbols carved into its stone lid. The crew foreman called the site's supervisor. The supervisor made some phone calls. Within hours, men in suits arrived and took control of the site. The crew was told to forget what they'd seen, and were given substantial bonuses to ensure their silence. The vault and its contents disappeared. The shopping centre was built. To this day, nobody knows what happened to the artefacts or who those men in suits were. The treasure hunters who survived these encounters learned an important lesson. If you find something real, you stay quiet. You don't post about it on social media, though that didn't exist for most of this history. You don't give interviews. You don't write books. You very carefully navigate the legal questions about claiming buried treasure on public or private land, and you hope nobody asks too many questions. And if you're smart, you ask yourself why this particular cache has gone undiscovered for over 100 years, why no one else has found it, and whether maybe, just maybe, it was left unfound for a reason. Whether someone is still keeping track, still watching, still guarding secrets their great-great-grandfathers swore to protect. The treasure hunters who've been at this for decades, the ones who are still alive and still willing to talk, they all tell similar stories. They'll be researching a promising site. They'll start finding markers. The symbols match documented KGC codes. The location makes historical sense. They'll plan an expedition. And then someone shows up. Could be a friendly local who warns them the property owner is litigious. Could be someone claiming to represent historical preservation interests. Could be people who don't bother with explanations, who just make it very clear through body language and implication that moving along would be the smart choice. It happens too often to be coincidence, too consistently across too many years in too many locations to be random chance. Chapter 8. The Gaps That Remain Here's the fundamental problem with the Knights of the Golden Circle story, and it's a problem that should bother anyone who values historical truth. We know they existed. That's not in dispute. We have membership rolls recovered from raids during the Civil War. We have meeting minutes captured by Union forces. We have contemporary newspaper accounts describing their activities. We have court documents from wartime trials of suspected members. The Knights of the Golden Circle were real. We know they were large, well-organised, and had significant influence in southern and border states. That's also thoroughly documented. Estimates of 40 to 60,000 members aren't wild speculation. They're based on captured documents, testimony from defectors, and Union intelligence reports compiled by people with no reason to exaggerate. We know they had money. Membership dues, sure, but also backing from wealthy southern planters and businessmen who saw the organisation as serving their interests. They had the resources to publish newspapers, fund expeditions, and maintain a network of meeting halls across multiple states. What we don't know is what happened to them after the war, and that gap in the historical record isn't just suspicious, it's gaping. It's the kind of hole that swallows entire conspiracy theories, and still has room for more. Most KGC documents were destroyed. Whether deliberately or through the chaos of war, the organisation's records largely vanished. We're not talking about a few missing ledgers. We're talking about entire archives that should exist but don't. Membership rolls that should list thousands of names just gone. Financial records that should show where money came from and where it went disappeared. Correspondence that should reveal the organisation's plans and operations destroyed or lost. Confederate files were burned as Richmond fell. That's documented. The Confederate government ordered the destruction of sensitive documents to prevent them from falling into Union hands. But which documents were considered most sensitive? Which were prioritised for destruction? Were KGC files among them? We don't know, because the records of what was destroyed were also destroyed. Post-war America had powerful reasons to bury the past and move forward. The country was exhausted, hundreds of thousands dead, the economy shattered, the social order completely upended. There was a genuine, understandable desire to just stop fighting and start rebuilding. Admitting that a large, well-funded secret society had survived the war and might still be operating would have been devastating to that effort. It would undermine everything Reconstruction was trying to accomplish. It would expose federal failures to control domestic threats. It would raise uncomfortable questions about missing Confederate assets and who might have access to them. It would suggest that the war hadn't really ended, just changed forms. So the official story became simple, clean, reassuring. The Knights of the Golden Circle were a pre-war conspiracy that faded away when their dreams of a southern empire died at Appomattox. They disbanded. Their members went home. Some joined other organisations like the Klan, but the KGC itself ceased to exist. End of story. Clean, simple, reassuring. Probably not true. Because here's what doesn't make sense about that narrative. Organisations don't usually announce when they disband, especially secret organisations. They don't take out newspaper ads saying the Knights of the Golden Circle are officially dissolved, thank you for your support. They just go quiet. And going quiet doesn't mean ceasing to exist. It just means becoming invisible. And there's another problem with the official narrative. The Knights had been planning for Confederate defeat since at least 1863, possibly earlier. There's evidence of this in captured correspondence. They were thinking long-term. They were preparing for a protracted struggle. They were hiding resources and building networks designed to survive military defeat. Why would an organisation that had spent years preparing for defeat suddenly give up the moment defeat actually came? That's not how groups work, especially groups built on ideology and bound by blood oaths. The more logical explanation is that they did exactly what they'd been planning to do. They went underground, they protected their resources, they waited, and maybe, just maybe, they're still waiting. Chapter 9. The question that won't die. Let's lay out what we know for certain. The Knights of the Golden Circle existed as a large organised secret society before and during the Civil War. Fact. Large amounts of Confederate gold and assets disappeared at the end of the war with no clear accounting. Fact. Treasure markers and coded symbols appeared across the South in the decades following the war. Fact. People who investigated these markers often met with mysterious deaths or intimidation. Fact. The early Ku Klux Klan emerged with a structure and spread pattern that resembled earlier Confederate secret societies. Fact. What we don't know is how these facts connect, and that's where it gets interesting. If the Knights of the Golden Circle really did plan for Confederate defeat, if they really did hide massive wealth, if they really did embed themselves into post-war American society, then we have to ask some uncomfortable questions. How long did they survive? What did they become? Did they evolve into something else? Or did they eventually fade away? If the gold still exists, who's guarding it now? And here's the most disturbing possibility. What if they never went away at all? What if the Knights of the Golden Circle simply learned to operate in the shadows, influencing events without drawing attention, maintaining their network across generations? Secret societies don't usually announce when they disband. They just stop being visible. That doesn't mean they stop existing. Chapter 10. The evidence in the ground. There's a reason treasure hunters are still looking for KGC gold, and it's not just fantasy or delusion or the appeal of a romantic mystery. Real discoveries have been made. Documented discoveries. the kind that make it into newspapers and legal proceedings because people have to figure out who owns what and how much tax is owed. In the 1980s, a man in Arkansas whose name was never publicly released found a cache of gold coins buried on property he'd recently purchased. The coins were genuine Civil War-era gold, worth a small fortune even at face value, worth much more to collectors, and they were buried in a very specific pattern, arranged in a way that matched documented KGC symbols. This wasn't random. This wasn't some Confederate soldier burying his pay. This was organised, intentional, and coded. The man did everything right legally. He reported the find to authorities. He paid taxes on the value. He worked with archaeologists to document the site properly. And then he never said another word about where exactly he found it, or what else might be out there. When reporters tried to follow up, he refused all interviews. When treasure hunters tried to trace the location based on public records, they hit dead ends. The man knew what he'd found, reported enough to stay legal, and then sealed his mouth shut. Why? What did he know? What did he suspect? Did someone approach him? Did he figure out on his own that staying quiet was the smart choice? In the 1990s, a construction crew in Texas, working on a highway expansion project, accidentally uncovered a stone vault. This wasn't a treasure hunter's fantasy. This was heavy equipment operated by workers who didn't care about Civil War history. They just wanted to finish the job and go home. The vault was about 4 feet long, 3 feet wide, sealed with mortar that had held for over a century. Inside, they found Confederate currency, personal effects including letters and a diary, and various items that indicated this had been buried by someone with means and connections. The vault had KGC symbols carved into its stone lid, not painted, not scratched, carved deep, meant to last, meant to identify to those who knew the code. The contents were turned over to local historians and eventually ended up in a museum collection. But here's the interesting part. The exact location of the find was never publicly disclosed. The construction records show a general area, but not specific coordinates. When asked why, state officials cited concerns about treasure hunters and site preservation. But the site was under a highway. There was no site left to preserve. What were they really protecting? These aren't urban legends. These are documented finds with paperwork, witnesses, and physical artifacts, which means the rumours weren't all fantasy. Something really was buried out there. The question is, how much and who knows where? In 2007, a metal detecting hobbyist in Kentucky found a sealed mason jar containing gold coins and a document on private property with the owner's permission. The document was a letter, dated 1866, with what appeared to be coded instructions. The letter referenced the circle and mentioned that what is buried shall remain until the time is right. The gold coins alone were worth over $30,000. The letter has never been fully decoded, though several cryptographers have tried. The finder split the proceeds with the property owner as agreed. They both signed non-disclosure agreements at the advice of their lawyers, which seems like an odd thing to do over a jar of old coins unless someone was worried about something more than taxes. And here's something that should make you think. In almost every documented case of KGC-related treasure being found, the finders either stay quiet afterward or face mysterious pressure to stop looking, stop talking, stop investigating. It's not every time. Some people find old coins and that's the end of it. But when the find includes KGC symbols, when it appears to be part of a larger pattern, when it suggests there's more out there, that's when things get strange. That's when people start getting careful about what they say. Chapter 11. The Map That Can't Be Read. Here's something that genuinely haunts researchers who study the KGC. Something that keeps them up at night turning over possibilities in their minds. Authentic treasure maps allegedly created by the Knights do exist in various museums and private collections across the South. They've been authenticated as period documents by multiple experts. The paper is right, matching paper stock from the 1860s. The ink is right, consistent with iron gall ink used during the Civil War era. The handwriting matches known Confederate styles and shows the characteristic flourishes of educated men from that period. These aren't obvious forgeries created by modern hoaxers. These are genuine 19th century documents, but they can't be read. And that's the problem that's driven cryptographers and treasure hunters to distraction for over a century. The maps use a cipher system that has never been fully cracked. Symbols that might represent landmarks, distances or directions, but without a key, without the code book or verbal instructions that would have been passed between members, they're just intricate drawings. Beautiful, precise, maddeningly useless drawings. Some researchers have spent entire careers trying to decode these maps. They've applied every known cipher technique from the 1800s. They've tried substitution ciphers, where each symbol represents a letter or number. They've tried transposition ciphers, where the symbols need to be rearranged according to a pattern. They've tried book ciphers, where the symbols might reference specific words in well-known texts like the Bible or Shakespeare. Nothing works completely. They can make educated guesses. They can extrapolate based on geographical knowledge and historical context. They can sometimes identify what might be a church or a river or a crossroads, but they can't definitively read the maps from start to finish. They can't follow the instructions the way the original knights would have. And here's what makes it even more frustrating. The cipher system appears to be multi-layered. Some symbols seem to be straightforward landmarks. A church might be indicated by a cross, a river by wavy lines. But then other symbols are clearly coded, and the code itself might vary from map to map, suggesting that different castles or different members use different variants of the base system. It's brilliant security when you think about it. Even if someone captured a map, even if they understood that it led to buried treasure, they couldn't follow it without additional knowledge. Knowledge that would have been passed down verbally from member to member, perhaps through the initiation rituals or through private instruction from castle leaders to their most trusted subordinates. It's the perfect security system for its time. A treasure map that requires human knowledge to interpret. Knowledge that might have died with its keepers as the organisation aged, and members passed away without proper successors. Or knowledge that might still be held by someone somewhere who knows exactly what they're protecting and why. And here's the really interesting thing that comes up when you talk to modern cryptographers who've worked on these maps. They say the cipher system shows signs of being deliberately designed to be unbreakable without the key. It's not just complex. It's structured in a way that prevents pattern analysis from working. The symbols don't repeat in predictable ways. There aren't enough examples to do frequency analysis. It's as if whoever designed the system understood the principles of cryptography well enough to build in defences against the standard code-breaking techniques. Where did a group of southern conspirators in the 1850s and 60s get that kind of expertise? Some members had military training, sure, but this is more sophisticated than military field codes of that era. Some researchers speculate that KGC leaders studied European secret society traditions, borrowing techniques from groups like the Freemasons or even older organisations. Or maybe they just had someone in the organisation who was genuinely brilliant at creating codes. Someone whose identity we'll never know because the records burned with Richmond. Chapter 12. The Modern Search. Today, there's a subculture of treasure hunters, historians, and conspiracy enthusiasts who are still looking for KGC gold. They compare notes online, they share theories, they make expeditions into remote areas of the South with metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar. Most find nothing. Some find bottles and old nails. A few find things they won't talk about publicly. Because here's what they've learned. If you find something real, you stay quiet. You don't post about it on social media. You don't give interviews. You very carefully navigate the legal questions about claiming buried treasure on public or private land. And if you're smart, you ask yourself why no one else has found this in over 150 years, and whether maybe it was left unfound for a reason. The treasure hunters who've been at this for decades tell the same story. They'll be researching a promising site. They'll start finding markers. The symbols match. The location makes sense. They'll plan an expedition. And then someone shows up. Could be a local property owner. Could be someone claiming historical preservation concerns. Could be people who just make it clear they should move along. It happens too often to be coincidence. Final chapter. What if it's true? Let's do a thought experiment. Let's say everything the conspiracy theorists claim is true. The Knights of the Golden Circle survived the Civil War. They hid massive amounts of Confederate wealth. They evolved, adapted, and maintained their organisation across generations. What would that mean? It would mean there's a secret society, over 150 years old, sitting on a fortune in gold and historical artefacts. It would mean they've successfully stayed hidden while the world changed completely around them. It would mean they've passed down knowledge, rituals and responsibilities through multiple generations. It would mean they're still out there. Now, let's be clear. I'm not saying this is what happened. I'm saying it's what some people believe happened. And the reason they believe it is because the alternative explanations have gaps you could drive a truck through. Where did the Confederate gold go? It was lost doesn't really answer the question when witnesses say it was deliberately hidden. Why do treasure markers appear across the South? It's a hoax doesn't explain why people keep dying when they find them. How did the early Klan spread so quickly with such sophisticated organisation? Confederate veterans is a vague answer that doesn't account for the resources involved. The official history has gaps. The conspiracy theory fills those gaps. Maybe not correctly, but it fills them with a narrative that's at least coherent. Epilogue. The truth we'll never know. Here's what I believe after researching this topic for hours and hours, after reading everything I could find, after talking to treasure hunters and historians and people who've spent their lives chasing these shadows. The Knights of the Golden Circle were absolutely real. They were large, influential and genuinely dangerous. They absolutely played a significant role in pushing the South toward a secession and supporting the Confederate cause during the Civil War. That's not speculation. That's documented historical fact. I also believe that Confederate gold was deliberately hidden at the end of the war. Not all of it. Probably not even most of it. A lot of Confederate wealth really was lost to chaos, stolen by deserters, or seized by Union forces. But significant amounts, meaningful amounts, were deliberately cached by people who hoped and believed the South would rise again and need those resources. This also isn't wild speculation. We have witness testimony, we have documented discoveries, we have too many consistent accounts across too many years to dismiss it all as fantasy. Were those people members of the KGC? Probably some of them were. The KGC was the most organised, most sophisticated secret society in the Confederacy. They had the structure, the discipline and the ideology to carry out long-term plans. It makes perfect logical sense they'd be involved in any plan to hide assets and prepare for a protracted resistance. Did they survive as an organisation after the war? That's where it gets murky, where the facts blur into speculation and possibility. I think elements of the KGC probably did persist for a while, maybe even for decades. The infrastructure was there, the ideology was there, the motivation was certainly there. Organisations don't just evaporate when they lose a war, especially organisations built on blood oaths and shared secrets. But did they maintain the same structure and goals as the war years? Did they evolve into something else, something adapted to the changed reality of post-war America? Did they eventually just fade away as members died, and their secrets died with them, as the world changed too much for their antebellum dreams to make any sense? I don't know. Nobody knows. That's the frustrating and fascinating thing about this story. What I do know is that treasure hunters are still finding things, not in huge numbers, but consistently enough that it can't all be dismissed. Symbols are still carved in stone across the South, weathered but visible if you know where to look, and people who know the history, who've studied it deeply, still get uncomfortable when you start asking questions about certain locations. There's still something there, whether it's actual buried gold or just the cultural memory of secrets that were real once. I can't say for certain. Something happened in the 1860s. The evidence is there in archives and museums. The gaps in the historical record are there in what's missing from those same archives. The unanswered questions are there in every documentary find that raises 10 new questions. Maybe the truth is mundane. A bunch of Confederate sympathisers buried some gold with the best of intentions. They drew maps and carved markers, but time passed. They died. Their children didn't care about the old cause. The markers eroded. Development covered burial sites. The treasure either doesn't exist in meaningful quantities anymore, or is lost forever, buried under highways and shopping centres and suburban sprawl. That's one possibility. It's a reasonable possibility. It might even be the truth. Or maybe the truth is stranger. Maybe there really is a network of guardians, not an organised secret society like the original Knights, but a tradition passed down through certain families. Knowledge that great-great-grandfather was trusted with something important. A sense of duty to protect what was hidden, even if the original cause is long dead and the gold itself matters less than the principle of keeping faith with the past. I can't tell you which it is. I can only tell you that the Knights of the Golden Circle definitely existed. They had the means, motive, and opportunity to hide Confederate wealth. They planned for defeat and prepared for a long struggle, and over a century and a half later, people are still looking for what they left behind, still finding markers and symbols, still encountering mysteries that resist easy explanation. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the mystery itself is the legacy. Not gold or secret societies or conspiracy theories, but the reminder that history has gaps, that the official story is often incomplete, that there are always secrets just beneath the surface of what we think we know. Closing thoughts. Were the Knights of the Golden Circle just a failed Confederate relic? A historical footnote about Southern extremists who dreamed too big and lost? Or were they America's first true underground power network? An organisation that planned for the long game, that hid resources and embedded themselves so deeply in post-war society that they became invisible? And if the gold still exists, sitting in caves or buried under farmland or hidden in places no one has looked for 150 years, who's guarding it now? Is it still being guarded at all? Or has time finally won, and the secrets of the Knights of the Golden Circle died with the last generation that knew them? I don't have answers, just questions. And the more you dig into this story, the more questions you'll have too. So maybe that's the real legacy of the Knights of the Golden Circle. Not gold or secret societies or conspiracy theories. Just questions that won't die, gaps in history that won't be filled, symbols carved in stone that no one alive can fully interpret, and treasure hunters still walking into the woods, looking for something that might not want to be found. Thanks for listening tonight. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of America's most persistent mysteries, please consider supporting the channel. Use those hype points. Leave that Spotify review. Drop a comment telling us where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. We genuinely love seeing where this content reaches, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now would be a great time. We've got more stories like this coming, more gaps in history that need exploring, more questions that deserve to be asked. Until next time, sleep well. And if you're ever hiking in the Georgia wilderness and you see a stone with a turtle carved into it, maybe just keep walking. Some secrets have stayed buried this long for a reason. Good night. Before we begin, if you're enjoying this story and finding it as fascinating as we do, please consider using your hype points on this video. It really helps the channel grow more than you could possibly know, and it allows us to keep bringing you these deep dives into the mysteries that keep us all awake at night. Also, if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, whether you're watching the sunrise in Tokyo or settling in for the night in London. It's not required, but we genuinely enjoy connecting with our global community. Now, before we dive into tonight's story, I want to give a massive thank you to KD Lofty for suggesting this topic. This is one we've been wanting to cover for a long time, and your suggestion was the perfect push we needed. Imagine holding a secret so profound that releasing it could rewrite human history. Imagine being told to stay silent, not by choice, but by order. Now imagine that secret involves the most watched moment in television history, the Apollo 11 moon landing, and what 3 astronauts allegedly saw on the lunar surface that was never meant to reach the public. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on one of the most explosive conspiracy theories ever to emerge from the space race, a missing transmission, a hidden film reel, and the terrifying possibility that humanity's first steps on the moon were also our first encounter with something we were never supposed to find. Apollo 11. The transmission they never released. Part 1. The engineer's confession. The fluorescent lights in the Houston diner flickered as journalist Marcus Webb sat across from a man who looked like he'd been carrying the weight of the world for 50 years. Ernest Hale was 83 years old, his hands trembling slightly as they wrapped around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. The wrinkles on his face seemed to deepen in the harsh light, and his eyes, once sharp and calculating during his years as a NASA communications engineer, now held something different. Fear, regret, and an urgent need to unburden himself before time ran out. 2 minutes and 42 seconds, Hale said, his voice barely above a whisper. That's how much they cut. Marcus had received the cryptic email 3 weeks earlier. No details, just a time and a place, and a single line that had made his investigative instincts flare to life, like a signal fire in the darkness. I know what Armstrong really saw on the moon. As a journalist specialising in declassified government documents and Cold War-era conspiracies, Marcus had heard plenty of wild claims about Apollo 11. Most were easily debunked fantasies, the kind of stories that fell apart the moment you applied even basic scrutiny. But something about Hale's message felt different. The man had credentials, a verifiable 40-year career at NASA, working specifically in communications during the Apollo program. This wasn't some basement-dwelling theorist. This was someone who had been in the room. "You're telling me NASA deliberately cut audio from the moon landing broadcast?" Marcus asked, activating the voice recorder on his phone and sliding it across the table. Hale nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the window where the Texas sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and red. Not just audio. There was a complete transmission blackout for exactly 2 minutes and 42 seconds, right after Armstrong set foot on the surface. The public version shows a brief interruption, static, technical difficulties. That's the official story. But I was in the communications room that night. I heard everything. "And what did you hear?" The old man's hands tightened around his cup. Armstrong's voice, different than before, shaken. He said, and I quote, "They're here. They're watching us." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine despite the warm Texas evening. They? That's what he said. Houston immediately switched him to the medical channel, the encrypted line. Protocol was that channel was only for health emergencies, astronaut vital signs, things like that. But they used it for something else that day. They used it to have a conversation the world was never meant to hear. Marcus leaned forward, his journalistic skepticism warring with the undeniable conviction in Hale's voice. "Why are you telling me this now? Why wait 50 years? Hale's laugh was bitter and hollow. "Because I'm dying. Pancreatic cancer. The doctors give me 4 months, maybe 6 if I'm lucky. I've kept this secret for half a century because I was afraid. Afraid of losing my pension, afraid of being labelled a lunatic, afraid of what they might do to keep me quiet. But I'm out of time, and I can't take this to my grave. Someone needs to know the truth." The engineer reached into a worn leather satchel beside him and pulled out a manila folder, its edges frayed from age. Inside were photocopied pages, technical diagrams, and what appeared to be mission transcripts with entire sections blacked out. "This is everything I managed to save before they sanitized the records," Hale said, sliding the folder across the table. "Start with July 20th, 1969. Start with the real history, then I'll show you where the lies begin." Part 2. The Descent. Marcus spent the next 3 days immersed in the documented facts of Apollo 11, separating verifiable history from speculation. The mission had launched on July 16, 1969, from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. 3 men, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, embarked on humanity's most ambitious journey. Their destination was the Sea of Tranquility, a vast lunar plain chosen for its relatively flat terrain. The early stages of the mission proceeded flawlessly. The Saturn V rocket performed exactly as designed, pushing the command module and lunar module out of Earth's orbit and onto a trajectory toward the Moon. For 3 days, the crew travelled through the void of space, performing course corrections and systems checks, their every movement monitored by ground control in Houston. On July 20th, Armstrong and Aldrin entered the lunar module, nicknamed Eagle, and began their descent to the surface while Collins remained in the command module, Columbia, orbiting above. This was where the first anomaly occurred, one that was documented in the official records but never fully explained. As Eagle descended toward the lunar surface, computer alarms began screaming in the cramped cockpit. Error code 1201, then 1202. Program alarms that indicated the guidance computer was being overwhelmed with data, receiving more information than it could process. In the official NASA narrative, these alarms were caused by a radar system inadvertently left on, flooding the computer with unnecessary data. Flight controllers in Houston made a split-second decision to proceed with the landing despite the alarms, trusting that the computer could handle the essential functions even while overloaded. But in Hale's documents, in the margins of a photocopied mission transcript, someone had written in pencil, "Alarms triggered by external scan. Eagle detected and scanned by." The question mark hung there, ominous and unfinished. Armstrong took manual control of Eagle, guiding it away from a boulder-strewn crater toward a smoother landing site. At this point, fuel was running critically low. The mission clock showed they had less than 30 seconds of landing fuel remaining when Armstrong's voice crackled through the speakers in Houston. "Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed." The date was July 20th, 1969. The time was 8:17 post-meridium Universal Time. Humanity had reached the Moon, but according to Hale, something was already waiting there. Part 3. The First Steps and the Missing Minutes. 6.5 hours after landing, Neil Armstrong opened the hatch of the lunar module and began his careful descent down the ladder. The world watched grainy black and white images transmitted from a camera mounted on Eagle's exterior. An estimated 600 million people across the globe had their eyes fixed on television screens, witnessing something that had existed only in science fiction just a decade before. At 10:56 post-meridium Eastern Time, Armstrong's boot touched the lunar surface. His words became instant history. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." The broadcast continued for several minutes, showing Armstrong's initial movements on the surface, his commentary about the fine, powdery consistency of the lunar soil, and his growing confidence in the low-gravity environment. Then, at approximately 11:02 post-meridium Eastern Time, the broadcast experienced what NASA described as a technical interruption. Static-filled television screens around the world. Walter Cronkite, anchoring CBS's coverage, assured viewers that engineers were working to restore the signal. The interruption lasted 2 minutes and 42 seconds, just as Hale had said. When the feed returned, Armstrong was further from the lunar module, collecting samples, and everything appeared normal. The mission proceeded. Aldrin joined him on the surface. They planted the American flag, collected rocks, set up scientific instruments, and spoke with President Nixon via a radio hookup. Then they returned to Eagle, launched back to orbit, docked with Columbia, and began the journey home. The official explanation for the broadcast interruption was a temporary failure in the signal relay from the Australian tracking station at Honeysuckle Creek. Equipment malfunction. Nothing unusual. The missing minutes were simply dead air, static, an unfortunate technical glitch in an otherwise flawless broadcast. But Hale's documents told a different story. In the folder he'd given Marcus was a page that appeared to be from an internal NASA communications log. Most of it was standard technical jargon, signal strength readings, tracking data, confirmation of uplink and downlink status. But there was one entry, time-stamped at 11:01 post-meridian Eastern Time, that made Marcus's heart race. Switch to med channel on CDR request. Override standard protocol. Restricted transcript to follow. Public feed hold for 2.7 minutes. CDR commander. Neil Armstrong had requested the channel switch himself. And there was something else in the folder. A fragmentary transcript labelled Apollo 11 EVA Medical Channel Excerpt, July 20, 1969, 11:01 to 11:03 p.m. Eastern. Most of it was redacted, thick black lines covering entire paragraphs, but a few lines remained visible. Armstrong. Houston, we have... There are other craft here. Repeat, other craft. Houston. Say again, Eagle. Armstrong. They're on the ridge. 3 of them. Lined up. They're watching us. Houston. Stand by, Eagle. Switching to... The rest was blacked out. Marcus read the fragment a dozen times, his mind racing. If this was authentic, if Armstrong had really reported seeing craft on the moon, then the implications were staggering. But he needed more than a photocopied document from a dying man. He needed corroboration. That's when Hale mentioned the second camera feed. Part 4. The hidden feed. According to Hale, there were 2 video channels transmitting from the Apollo 11 mission. The public feed, broadcast worldwide, originated from the camera mounted on Eagle's descent stage. But there was a second feed, encrypted and transmitted on a classified frequency, that went directly to a secure facility in Houston, with simultaneous feeds to Langley Air Force Base and the Pentagon. The second camera was inside Armstrong's helmet, Hale explained during their second meeting, this time at his modest ranch house on the outskirts of Houston. Part of the biomedical monitoring system officially. It was supposed to record the astronauts' field of view for training and debriefing purposes. But the real reason was reconnaissance. The Air Force wanted independent visual confirmation of everything the astronauts encountered. And you saw this second feed? Marcus asked. Hale nodded. I was part of the team monitoring communications integrity. I had access to all the channels, including the restricted ones. When Armstrong made his first report about the craft, they switched the helmet camera feed to the main screen in the control room. That's when I saw them. Them. Structures. On a ridge about half a mile from the landing site, cylindrical, metallic. They weren't natural formations. The shadows they cast were geometric, precise, and while we watched, one of them moved. Marcus felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Moved how? It rotated, slowly, like it was tracking Armstrong's position. Then the feed cut out. Someone at a higher pay grade than me pulled the plug. When it came back online 30 seconds later, the camera was pointed at the ground. We never saw those structures again. And no one said anything? No one questioned it? Hale's expression hardened. 3 people in that room saw what I saw. 2 of them are dead now. The 3rd won't return my calls. We were told immediately after the mission that what we'd witnessed was classified under national security protocols. We signed additional non-disclosure agreements. We were reminded that violating those agreements would be considered treason. Marcus tried to process this. But why? If there were structures on the moon, artificial structures, why hide it? That would be the most significant discovery in human history. Think about it, Hale said quietly. July 1969. We're still in the Cold War. We've just beaten the Soviets to the moon by a matter of months. Now imagine announcing to the world that we found evidence of non-human intelligence up there. What happens? Panic? Maybe. But more importantly, what happens to the space race? Do the Americans and Soviets suddenly start cooperating? Do other nations demand access to lunar exploration? Do we lose our strategic advantage? So you're saying they covered it up for geopolitical reasons. I'm saying they covered it up because they didn't know what they were dealing with. Were these structures abandoned? Active? Were they watching us? Could they be hostile? The people making decisions decided it was safer to study this quietly, secretly, rather than denounce it to a world that wasn't ready. Marcus leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed. I need to verify this. I need to talk to other people who were there. Hale smiled sadly. Good luck. Most of them are dead or won't talk. But there's one person you might try. Rosa Klein. She worked in the NASA archives for 30 years. She might remember some things. Part 5. The Archivist's Evidence. Rosa Klein lived in a small apartment in Pasadena, California, surrounded by stacks of books, photographs, and memories of a lifetime spent preserving humanity's reach into space. She was 76 years old, sharp as a tack, and deeply suspicious when Marcus first contacted her. Ernest Hale sent you? She asked over the phone, her voice guarded. I haven't spoken to Ernest in 20 years. Why would he send someone to me now? Because he's dying, Marcus said simply, and he wants the truth to come out before he goes. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Klein sighed. Come to Pasadena, we'll talk, but I'm not promising anything. 3 days later, Marcus sat in Klein's cramped living room, drinking tea from delicate china cups that seemed wildly out of place given the conversation they were about to have. I worked in the NASA archives from 1972 to 2002, Klein began, her eyes distant with memory. My job was to catalogue, preserve, and maintain access to mission documentation, photographs, film, audio recordings, everything. Apollo 11 was before my time, but the documentation from that mission was extensive. Thousands of photographs, hours of film, telemetry data, mission reports. And you found something unusual? Marcus prompted. Klein set down her teacup carefully. In 1987, I was conducting a routine inventory of Apollo 11 photographic materials. We had recently digitized a batch of images, and I was cross-referencing the digital copies against the physical archives. That's when I noticed discrepancies. What kind of discrepancies? Missing images. The photo manifest, the official list of every photograph taken during the mission, listed several images that weren't in the archive. The designations were sequential, standard NASA format, as 11-something something. But when I tried to locate the physical photographs, they were gone. And here's the strange part. The gaps in the sequence all fell within a specific time frame. Let me guess, Marcus said. Right after the landing? Klein nodded. The missing images were all from the first 40 minutes Armstrong and Aldrin were on the surface. I filed a report about the discrepancy. 2 weeks later, my supervisor called me into his office and told me I'd made a mistake. The missing photos had never existed. The manifest I'd seen was an early draft that included planned photos that were never actually taken due to time constraints. But you didn't believe that? Of course not. I'd been doing that job for 15 years. I knew the difference between a preliminary photo plan and a completed mission manifest. But I also knew when to keep my mouth shut. I let go. Officially. And unofficially? Klein stood and walked to a bookshelf crammed with binders and folders. She pulled out a slim blue folder and handed it to Marcus. Inside was a photocopy of a document, yellowed with age but still legible. It was a photo manifest stamped with official NASA headers and dated August 5th, 1969. Marcus scanned the list of image designations, his pulse quickening as he saw the gaps Klein had mentioned. AS-11-43 through AS-11-51 were missing. 8 consecutive images. I made a copy before they sanitized the records, Klein said quietly. I knew someday someone would ask questions. I just didn't think it would take this long. What do you think those photos showed? Klein sat back down, her hands folded in her lap. I think they showed whatever Armstrong and Aldrin saw on that ridge. I think someone at NASA or the Pentagon decided those images were too sensitive to remain in the public archive, so they removed them and pretended they never existed. Marcus felt the pieces starting to come together, but he still needed more. Did you ever hear anything else? Rumours? Gossip? Anything about what might have been on those photos? Klein hesitated, then nodded slowly. There was an old technician, worked in photo processing during the Apollo era. He retired in the late 80s. We used to have lunch sometimes, talk shop. One day, After a few drinks, he told me about a special project he'd worked on. He called it the clean-up detail. Clean-up? His job was to retouch lunar surface photos before they were released to the public. NASA claimed it was just to enhance clarity, improve contrast, make the images more suitable for publication, but he said they were removing things, shadows that didn't match the terrain, reflections that couldn't be explained, dark silhouettes on distant horizons. Marcus's mind was racing. Did he say specifically what they were removing? He wouldn't give details, but he did say one thing I've never forgotten. He said the moon wasn't empty when we got there. He said it was never empty. Part 6. The Astronaut's Silence. Michael Collins, the third member of the Apollo 11 crew, orbited the moon alone in the command module Columbia, while Armstrong and Aldrin made history on the surface below. Every public account emphasized his isolation. The loneliest man in the universe, they called him, cut off from all human contact during his passes around the moon's far side. But according to Hale's documents, Collins made his own disturbing observations during those solitary orbits. Marcus tracked down a former NASA public affairs officer who'd worked with Collins during post-mission appearances. The man, who insisted on anonymity, agreed to meet at a bar in Clear Lake, Texas, not far from the Johnson Space Center. Collins was different after Apollo 11, the former officer said, nursing a beer and keeping his voice low despite the noise of the sports bar around them. Armstrong and Aldrin got all the attention, obviously, but Collins was the one who seemed most affected by the experience. He did the appearances, the tours, the press conferences, but there was something in his eyes, like he'd seen something that changed him. Did he ever talk about it? Marcus asked. Not publicly, but there were private moments. I travelled with him for 2 years after the mission, helping coordinate media appearances. One night we're in a hotel in Tokyo, both of us jet-lagged, sitting in the bar at 3 a.m. He's had a few drinks, more than usual, and he starts talking about the far side of the moon. Marcus leaned closer. What did he say? He said being on the far side was strange. Total radio silence from Earth, from Houston, from the lunar module. Just him and the cosmos. He said that's when he saw it. Saw what? The former officer took a long drink before answering. A light, moving alongside Columbia. At first he thought it was debris, part of the spacecraft, or maybe something from the lunar module, but it paced him. Matched his orbital velocity perfectly. Stayed at a constant distance. He watched it for 3 complete orbits. Then, right as he was about to come back around to the near side, it accelerated and disappeared. Did he report it? He said he did, on the private channel once he re-established contact with Houston. They told him it was probably space junk or an optical illusion from the sun reflecting off particles. But Collins didn't buy it. He said he knew what space debris looked like, and this wasn't it. This was deliberate. This was something watching him. Marcus felt his excitement building. Is there any record of this report? The former officer shook his head. If there is, it's buried deep. Collins never mentioned it publicly. But here's the thing. I wasn't the only one he told. There were others over the years. People he trusted. We all signed NDAs, promised never to discuss conversations we had with the astronauts. But I figure after 50-some years, and with you already digging into this, maybe it's time. Back in his hotel room that night, Marcus reviewed everything he'd gathered so far. Hale's testimony about the transmission blackout and the helmet camera feed. Klein's evidence of missing photographs and image manipulation. Now Collins's unreported sighting in lunar orbit. The pattern was becoming clear. Multiple independent sources all pointing to the same conclusion. Something happened during Apollo 11 that was deliberately concealed from the public. But he still needed the smoking gun. He needed direct testimony from one of the astronauts themselves. That's when he remembered Hale mentioning Buzz Aldrin. Part 7. The Aldrin Interview. Buzz Aldrin was the second human to walk on the moon, and over the decades since Apollo 11, he'd become known for his candour, his willingness to speak about his experiences and struggles. He'd discussed his battles with depression and alcoholism, his frustrations with NASA, bureaucracy, his thoughts on the future of space exploration. and on a few notable occasions he'd hinted at something unusual during the Apollo 11 mission. Marcus found a reference to a 1996 interview that Aldrin had done with a small aerospace magazine. The interview had never been published, supposedly due to editorial disagreements, but the journalist who conducted it, a woman named Patricia Hammond, was still alive and working as a freelance writer in Florida. When Marcus called her, Hammond's response was immediate and defensive. "I don't talk about that interview. I signed an agreement." "With NASA?" Marcus asked. "With lawyers representing NASA. They made it very clear that certain portions of my conversation with Aldrin were not suitable for publication. They compensated me for my time and my silence." "But you still have the recording?" A long pause. Then quietly, "Maybe." It took 3 more phone calls, a promise to keep her name out of any publication, and a wire transfer of $5,000 before Hammond agreed to send Marcus a digital copy of the suppressed portion of the interview. What he heard made his hands shake. The interview audio was scratchy, clearly recorded on older equipment, but the voices were clear. Hammond asking questions, Aldrin answering thoughtfully, until she asked about the famous UFO sighting during Apollo 11. In public statements over the years, Aldrin had acknowledged seeing something unusual during the flight to the moon, but always with caveats. It was probably a panel from the spacecraft separation. It could have been debris, nothing definitive, but in this unpublished interview his tone was different. "Hammond, there's been a lot of speculation about what you saw on the way to the moon. Can you describe it?" Aldrin, "We saw something, all 3 of us. It was following us, maintaining distance. It wasn't debris, because debris doesn't maintain formation. It wasn't the Saturn IV panel, because we could see that tumbling away in a different direction." Hammond, "What did it look like?" Aldrin, "Cylindrical, metallic. When the sun hit it at certain angles, it was brilliant. Other times it was dark, almost invisible. We reported it to Houston on a private channel." Hammond, "And what did Houston say?" Aldrin, "They told us not to discuss it publicly. They said it would cause unnecessary panic. But that wasn't the strangest part." Hammond, "What was the strangest part?" Aldrin, long pause. "When we landed on the moon, there were 3 more of them, on the ridge, just like the one that followed us. Same shape, same size, like they were waiting." Hammond, "You reported this as well?" Aldrin, "Of course. Neil did, immediately. That's when they cut the public feed and put us on the encrypted channel. They didn't want the world to hear what we were describing." Hammond, "What did you describe?" Aldrin, "Structures, technology, something that definitely wasn't human. We were told very clearly that this information was classified under national security protocols. We were told that discussing it could jeopardize not just the space program, but national security itself." Hammond, "And you've kept quiet all these years?" Aldrin, "What choice did I have? You think I wanted to be labelled a crackpot? You think I wanted to spend the rest of my life being questioned about little green men? But I'll tell you this, what we saw was real. It was there. And someone needs to find out what it was and why we were told to stay silent." The recording ended there. According to Hammond, that's when Aldrin's publicist had intervened, ended the interview, and initiated the legal process to suppress the recording. Marcus listened to it 5 more times, making detailed notes. This was it. Direct testimony from one of the Apollo 11 astronauts, on record, describing exactly what Hale had claimed: the structures on the ridge, the encrypted communication channel, the directive to remain silent, but he still needed to know what happened next. What did NASA do with this information? Where did it go? The answer, according to Hale, lay in a classified debriefing that took place 8 days after the astronauts returned to Earth. Part 8. The Secret Debriefing. On July 28, 1969, the Apollo 11 crew underwent their official mission debrief at the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston. The public version of this debrief covered technical aspects of the flight, equipment performance, scientific observations, and recommendations for future missions. The transcript runs to hundreds of pages and has been publicly available for decades. But according to documents Hale provided, there was a second classified debriefing that same day. This one took place in a secure conference room with only select personnel present. No press, no public record. And according to a fragmentary transcript Hale had managed to preserve, the discussion was explosive. The partial transcript Marcus received was heavily redacted, but enough remained to paint a disturbing picture. Classified debriefing, Apollo 11. Crew date, July 28, 1969. Location, Building 30, Manned Spacecraft Center. Present, redacted, redacted. N. Armstrong, E. Aldrin, M. Collins, redacted. Redacted. Gentlemen, this session is classified top secret. Nothing discussed here leaves this room. Is that understood? Armstrong. Understood. Redacted. Commander Armstrong, please describe in detail what you observed at 11:01 Eastern Time on July 20th. Armstrong. After exiting the LM and conducting initial surface assessment, I observed 3 cylindrical objects on a ridge approximately 0.8 kilometres from our position. The objects were metallic in appearance, vertical orientation, approximately redacted. Size estimate, Armstrong. Difficult to gauge at that distance, but estimated between 40 and 60 feet in height. They were arranged in a linear pattern, evenly spaced, redacted. Movement, Armstrong. The centre object appeared to rotate slowly. The rotation was observable due to a reflective surface that caught sunlight intermittently. I observed this for approximately 90 seconds before Houston requested channel switch, redacted. Colonel Aldrin, did you observe these objects as well? Aldrin, yes. When I exited the LM approximately 20 minutes later, I looked toward the ridge Armstrong had described. The objects were still visible. I observed what appeared to be independent illumination, a glow that wasn't consistent with solar reflection. Collins, I'd like to add something. Redacted. Go ahead. Collins. During my solo orbits, I observed a similar object maintaining position relative to Columbia. This was consistent across multiple orbits. The object matched our velocity and altitude precisely. When I reported this, I was instructed to... The transcript cuts off here. The remainder of the document was missing, but Hale had provided context in his notes. According to him, the debriefing had concluded with explicit instructions to the crew. They were to maintain absolute silence about their observations. They were told that investigation into the phenomena was ongoing at the highest levels of government, and that premature disclosure could compromise both national security and the space program itself. The astronauts had complied. For 50 years they'd carried the secret. But the government's investigation, according to Hale, had continued in the shadows. Part 9. The Pentagon Connection. The Defense Intelligence Agency had maintained close oversight of the Apollo program from its inception. While NASA was a civilian agency, the military implications of space exploration were obvious. Reconnaissance, communications, potential weapons platforms, all of these fell within DoD's purview. So when Apollo 11 reported anomalous objects on the lunar surface, it was the DIA that took the lead in analysing the implications. Marcus managed to track down a former DIA analyst who'd worked on aerospace intelligence during the late 1960s. The man, who insisted on using only the pseudonym Thomas, agreed to speak on condition of complete anonymity. The Apollo 11 findings triggered a complete reassessment of our understanding of the lunar environment, Thomas said during their secure video call. We'd been sending probes to the moon since the early 60s, Ranger, Surveyor, Lunar Orbiter. None of them had detected anything unusual. No structures, no anomalies. So when the Apollo crew reported what they saw, the initial reaction was skepticism. But they investigated, Marcus asked. Extensively. We pulled every photograph, every piece of telemetry data, every communication transcript. We analysed sun angles, shadow patterns, optical illusions. We even considered the possibility that the crew was hallucinating. Some kind of psychological break from the stress of the mission. But you couldn't explain it away. Thomas was silent for a long moment. No, the evidence was too consistent. 3 trained observers, all reporting the same phenomena independently. Visual confirmation from multiple angles. And then there were the photographs. The missing photographs from the archive, Marcus prompted. Those photos weren't missing. They were moved, classified. I saw some of them during the initial analysis. They showed exactly what the crew described. Cylindrical structures, geometric precision, surface composition inconsistent with natural lunar formations. So what did you conclude? Officially, the analysis was inconclusive. We couldn't definitively prove the objects were artificial, so we couldn't justify public disclosure. Unofficially, every analyst who saw that data knew we were looking at something that didn't belong there, something that predated our arrival. Alien technology, Thomas laughed bitterly. That's the obvious conclusion, isn't it? But here's the thing that bothered us most. The objects weren't ancient. They weren't covered in lunar dust. They weren't degraded by micrometeorite impacts or radiation. They looked new, which meant either they were recently placed there, or they were maintained somehow. That's terrifying. It gets worse. We analysed the trajectory of the object Collins reported shadowing the command module. Based on its behaviour, matching orbital velocity, maintaining precise distance, it would have required sophisticated propulsion and guidance systems, more sophisticated than anything we had at the time, maybe more sophisticated than anything we have now. Marcus felt a chill run through him. So what happened? Where did the investigation go from there? Above my pay grade, Thomas said. The analysis was kicked up to a special projects division. I heard rumours it was folded into a broader programme studying unexplained aerial phenomena, what we called UAPs, but the specifics were compartmentalised, need to know only, and I didn't need to know. Do you think we went back? Secretly? That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? We had 6 more Apollo missions after 11. 5 of them successfully landed on the moon. If I were running the program, I would have absolutely sent crews to investigate those structures, get closer, get better images, maybe even attempt contact. But whether that actually happened, I have no idea. The conversation left Marcus with more questions than answers, but it confirmed a crucial point. The Pentagon had taken the Apollo 11 observations seriously enough to launch a classified investigation, which meant the government believed something real had been detected on the moon. Now he needed to know what they found. Part 10. The Photo Laboratory. Following a lead from Rosa Klein, Marcus travelled to the former, site of Building 8 at the Manned Spacecraft Center, now the Johnson Space Center. The building no longer existed, demolished in the early 2000s during a facilities modernization project. But Klein had given him a name, Victor Reeves, a former photo technician who'd worked in Building 8 during the Apollo era. Reeves was 79 years old and living in a retirement community in Arizona. When Marcus called, the old man's voice was surprisingly strong and clear. "Building 8, Reeves said with a dry chuckle. "Haven't thought about that place in years. What's your interest?" Marcus explained his investigation, mentioning Hale's claims about photo manipulation and Klein's discovery of missing images. Reeves was quiet for a moment. Then, "I wondered when someone would finally start asking the right questions. Yeah, I worked the photo lab in Building 8 from 67 to 73. And yeah, we did cleanup work on Apollo images. Lots of it. Can you describe what that involved?" Officially, we were enhancing image quality, adjusting contrast, sharpening details, removing artifacts from the development process. And we did do that work. But there was another project. Smaller team, higher security clearance. We called it the Anomaly Review, which involved taking lunar surface photographs and removing anything that didn't fit the expected profile. And before you ask, yes, that included things that appeared artificial, geometric shapes, reflective surfaces where there shouldn't be reflections, shadows that didn't match the sun angle. We'd airbrush them out, retouch the surrounding terrain to make it look natural. How many photos are we talking about? From Apollo 11 specifically, maybe 20, 25 images, but it continued through the other missions. By the end of the Apollo program, we'd cleaned up hundreds of photos. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "Did you keep any of the originals? Before the retouching?" Reeves laughed. "Are you kidding? Everything was tracked. Every original, every work print, every final version. They ran inventory checks weekly. Taking anything out of that lab would have been instant dismissal and probably criminal charges. So there's no way to see what was removed?" "I didn't say that." Reeves paused. "Look, I was young, curious, and I had access to a camera. I may have photographed a few work prints before we retouched them. Just for my own records, you understand. Nothing official. Marcus could barely breathe. You still have those photographs? Maybe. They're old, faded. Been sitting in a box in my garage for 50 years. But if you want to come out to Arizona, I suppose I could dig them out. 2 days later, Marcus was sitting in Reeves's small garage, looking at faded Polaroid images that showed the lunar surface before NASA's cleanup crew got to work. The images were exactly as Reeves had described. Angular shadows that didn't match the terrain, bright. Reflections from areas that should have been in darkness. And in 3 photos, clear geometric shapes on distant ridges. One image in particular made Marcus's hand shake. It showed the horizon beyond the Apollo 11 landing site, and there, unmistakably, were 3 vertical structures arranged in a line. The resolution wasn't good enough to show fine details, but the basic shapes were clear. Cylindrical, metallic, utterly inconsistent with natural geology. "That's what you were looking for, isn't it?" Reeves said quietly. Marcus nodded, unable to speak. "Keep it," Reeves said. "I'm too old to care about NDAs anymore. If someone wants to prosecute an 80-year-old man for showing you a 50-year-old photo, let them try. The world deserves to know the truth." Part 11. Armstrong's Warning. The deeper Marcus dug into the Apollo 11 cover-up, the more he understood why the astronauts had remained silent for so long. The pressure applied to them hadn't just been bureaucratic or legal. It had been personal and intense. He found evidence of this in an unexpected place. The private papers of a former NASA administrator that had been donated to a university archive. Buried in routine correspondence from the 1970s was a memo from a DA liaison to NASA leadership, marked Eyes Only. The memo, dated April 3, 1970, outlined recommended protocols for managing astronaut testimony regarding classified mission observations. The language was bureaucratic, but the intent was clear. Astronauts who discussed their observations publicly would face administrative consequences, including loss of flight status, pension review, and potential criminal prosecution under espionage laws. But there was one instance where the pressure had almost broken. Marcus discovered this through an interview with the widow of a former NASA public affairs officer. Her husband had died in 2008, but she remembered a story he'd told her about Neil Armstrong at a White House event in 1985. "My husband said Armstrong had been drinking more than usual that night," she recalled. "There was a small reception after the main event, just a few dozen people. Armstrong was talking with some aerospace contractors, and my husband overheard him say something strange. He said, 'We were warned away. They didn't want us there.'" "Warned by who?" Marcus asked. "That's what my husband asked, but Armstrong just shook his head and walked away." The next day, my husband got a call from Armstrong's assistant, asking if he'd overheard anything unusual at the reception. When my husband asked why, the assistant said Armstrong had been under stress and may have made some inappropriate comments. They wanted to make sure nothing made it into the media. "Did your husband report what he heard?" "Not officially, but he told me he always wondered what Armstrong meant. Warned away by who and why?" The answer might have come from another source, a colleague of Armstrong's from his test pilot days who'd stayed in touch over the decades. The man, who asked not to be named, told Marcus about a conversation he'd had with Armstrong in the late 1990s. Neil was different after Apollo 11, the former pilot said. Quieter, more withdrawn. He did his public duties, but you could tell his heart wasn't in it. One day I asked him point blank, I said, "Neil, what really happened up there?" And he just looked at me with these tired eyes and said, "Some things are bigger than one man's conscience." What did he mean by that? I think he meant that he knew things the world should probably know, but that revealing them would cause more harm than good, or at least that's what he'd been convinced of. Part 12. The Final Evidence. Ernest Hale died on a Tuesday morning in late October, 4 months after his first meeting with Marcus. The cancer had progressed faster than the doctors predicted, but before he died, he made one final arrangement. Marcus received a package from Hale's attorney 3 days after the funeral. Inside was a small aluminum case, the kind used for storing film reels, and a handwritten note. "Marcus, if you're reading this, I've run out of time. Inside this case is the most important piece of evidence I managed to save. I've kept it hidden for 50 years, moving it from one secure location to another, always afraid someone would find it and destroy it. Now it's yours. Use it wisely. The truth matters more than my reputation or my legacy. Ernest." Inside the aluminum case was a 16mm film reel, carefully sealed in archival plastic. A label on the reel read, "Apollo 11, EVA restricted, do not duplicate." Marcus's hands trembled as he carefully removed the reel. He'd anticipated this moment, prepared for it by locating a restoration specialist who could safely digitize old film stock. 2 days later, he sat in the specialist's darkened studio and watched the film play on a modern screen. The footage was grainy, occasionally jumping and flickering with age, but it was unmistakably from the lunar surface. The perspective was from Armstrong's helmet camera, the same feed Hale had described seeing in the communications room. The timestamp in the corner showed 11:02 post-meridian Eastern Time, July 20th, 1969. The camera panned across the lunar landscape, grey regolith stretching to a sharp horizon against the black sky. Then the view shifted, focusing on a distant ridge. The image was shaky, affected by Armstrong's breathing and movement, but there was no mistaking what appeared in frame. 3 cylindrical structures, exactly as described in all the testimonies Marcus had gathered. They were metallic, catching the harsh sunlight and casting precise geometric shadows on the lunar surface. The centre structure appeared to be rotating slowly, its surface reflecting light in a pattern that seemed almost rhythmic. Then the audio kicked in, scratchy and broken but audible. A voice, Armstrong's, tight with tension. "Houston, do you copy this feed?" Static, then another voice from Houston. "We copy, Eagle. Maintain visual contact." Armstrong again. "It's moving, the centre one, it's rotating toward my position." Another voice, Aldrin's, in the background. "Neil, it's tracking you, it's definitely tracking you." Houston. "Stand by, Eagle, we're analysing." The camera continued to focus on the structures for another 30 seconds. Then suddenly the centre structure seemed to flare with light, a brilliant reflection that washed out the camera for several frames. When the image cleared, the camera was pointed at the ground. Armstrong's breathing was audible, rapid and shallow. Houston. "Eagle, redirect to surface sample collection. Acknowledge." Armstrong. "Acknowledged." The footage ran for another 10 seconds, showing only lunar soil, then cut to black. Marcus watched the film 6 times in total, making detailed notes, capturing screenshots, ensuring he had documented every frame. This was it. Physical evidence of exactly what Hale, Aldrin, and the others had described. It wasn't proof of alien life, but it was undeniable proof that something anomalous had been present on the moon during Apollo 11, and that NASA had deliberately concealed it. But as Marcus prepared to publish his findings, as he compiled all the evidence he'd gathered over 6 months of intensive investigation, something happened that changed everything. Part 13. The Message. The email arrived at 3:37 in the morning, jolting Marcus awake with its notification chime. The sender was listed as Concerned Observer, and the subject line read, "Before you publish." Marcus opened it with growing dread. "Marcus Webb, we know what you found. We know about Hale's testimony, Klein's documents, the Aldrin interview and the film. We've been watching your investigation with interest. Before you make the decision to release this information publicly, you should know something that Ernest Hale didn't. You should know what Apollo 12 found at the Ocean of Storms." The email included a single attachment, a PDF file with a simple title, Surveyor 3 Recovery Mission, Classified Addendum. Apollo 12 had landed on the moon in November 1969, just 4 months after Apollo 11. One of its mission objectives was to reach the Surveyor 3 probe, an unmanned lander that had touched down in April 1967. The astronauts successfully retrieved parts of Surveyor 3, bringing them back to Earth for analysis. That was the public story. The classified addendum told a very different tale. According to the document, when the Apollo 12 crew reached Surveyor 3, they found something unexpected. The probe had been moved, not by much, perhaps 15 feet from its original landing site, but it had definitely been relocated deliberately, carefully, and then set down in a new position. More disturbing, Surveyor 3's camera, which had been pointed west in all the original mission images from '67, was now pointed northeast, toward a series of geometric formations that hadn't been visible in the original photographs. The Apollo 12 crew had photographed these formations extensively, and the classified addendum included several of those images. They showed structures similar to what Armstrong and Aldrin had seen, cylindrical objects arranged in patterns, some partially buried in lunar regolith, others standing free. But there was one crucial difference. These structures appeared older, weathered, covered in the fine dust that accumulates on the lunar surface over time. The document concluded with a chilling assessment. Evidence suggests long-term presence of non-terrestrial technology on the lunar surface. Origin, purpose, and current operational status remain unknown. Recommend continued classified investigation and absolute suppression of public disclosure, pending comprehensive threat assessment. The email's message continued below the attachment. This is just the beginning, Marcus. Apollo 14 found more. Apollo 15 made contact. Apollo 16 was warned to leave. Apollo 17 discovered why. If you release what you know about Apollo 11, we will be forced to release the complete record. Are you prepared for the world to know everything? Think carefully about what you're about to do. The email ended with no signature, no contact information, no way to respond. Marcus sat in his dark apartment staring at the screen, his mind racing. The implication was clear. There was far more to the lunar cover-up than just Apollo 11. The evidence he'd gathered was just the tip of an iceberg that extended through the entire Apollo program and possibly beyond. If he published his Apollo 11 findings, whoever sent this email, presumably someone within the intelligence community, with access to the full classified record, would retaliate by releasing even more explosive information. Information about contact, about warnings, about discoveries that might fundamentally challenge humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. Was he ready for that? Was the world ready for that? He thought about Ernest Hale, who'd spent 50 years carrying the weight of this secret, dying with the hope that the truth would finally emerge. He thought about the astronauts who'd been silenced, threatened, forced to deny what they'd witnessed. He thought about the public's right to know, weighed against the potential chaos that full disclosure might unleash. As dawn broke over his apartment window, Marcus sat at his computer, his article complete and ready to publish. Everything he'd found, every interview, every document, the film footage, all of it compiled into a comprehensive expose that would change history. His finger hovered over the publish button. On his other screen, the email from Concerned Observer remained open, its threat hanging in the digital air like a sword. If you release what you know about Apollo 11, we will release the complete record. Marcus Webb had spent his entire career searching for the truth, exposing secrets, bringing hidden information into the light. But now, faced with the biggest story of his life, he found himself paralyzed by a terrible question. What if some truths are too dangerous to tell? The cursor blinked on the screen. Publish. Don't publish. The choice that would define his legacy and possibly humanity's future. Outside, the sun rose over another ordinary day, in a world that had no idea what secrets lurked in the shadows of its greatest achievement. Marcus's finger remained frozen over the keyboard. The film reel sat in its aluminum case on his desk, 3 cylindrical structures captured forever on 16mm film, rotating slowly under an alien sun, watching, waiting, as they had been for 50 years. And somewhere in the classified archives of the United States government, the complete record of humanity's first contact waited in the darkness, neither confirmed nor denied, neither revealed nor forgotten, existing in that strange quantum state of truth that is simultaneously known and unknown, believed and doubted, terrifying and magnificent. The story of Apollo 11, the transmission they never released, remained balanced on the edge of revelation, as close to the light as it had ever been, and yet still shrouded in the same shadows that had concealed it since that July day in 1969, when three men looked up at structures on a lunar ridge and had their reality forever transformed. Marcus Webb stared at his screen, the weight of history pressing down on him, the future hanging in the balance, and the cursor blinked. Publish. Don't publish. The choice was his alone, but the truth, whatever it was, wherever it led, continued to exist independent of his decision, waiting in the lunar dust, patient and eternal, for the day when humanity would finally be ready to face what it had found among the stars.